Okay, looks like we're ready to go. I see the participant numbers stabilizing a bit. Hello to everybody that has just joined. Today we're going to be hosting a webinar to introduce the Bee Friendly Gardening Program, or BFG for short. BFG, like Bee City Canada, is a program of pollinator partnership, and its goal is to promote gardening for pollinators and to connect people that are interested in doing so. So we have the Bee Friendly Gardening Coordinator, Sara, with us today. And during her talk, she's going to introduce the program and its benefits, ways that engaging with bee friendly gardening can support the commitments that Bee City Canada members make when they join the program. And she's also going to walk through the process of creating habitat for pollinators. As a final reminder, if anyone would like to tune in French, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen and select French from there.
Je rappelle que si vous souhaitez écouter ce webinaire en français, il suffit de cliquer sur l'icône d'interprétation en bas de votre écran et sélectionner le français.
All right, before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that Pollinator Partnership Canada resides on. We acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I know we are participating today from all across Canada and perhaps even beyond Canada. So we do invite you to reflect on the land that you are on. Before we get into the talk today, I'm going to take a minute to introduce Sara. So Sara Wittenberg has a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology from Auburn University, where she examined causes of mortality of birds of prey admitted to a rehabilitation facility. And she has a Master's of Science in Biology from the University of Arkansas, where she explored the natal origins of migratory merlins and northern harriers. Her experience includes interning at the National Zoo in Costa Rica, directing the rehab program at the Southeastern Raptor Center, co-running a hawkwatch banding station in the Florida Keys, tracking gopher tortoise movements at Fort Benning, Georgia, conducting breeding bird surveys for the U.S. Forest Service, conducting sandhill crane sage-grouse surveys for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and assisting with Cornell University's search for the ivory-billed woodpecker. As a secondary education teacher, she believes strongly in sharing her passion for the natural world with the next generation of conservationists. In her free time, Sara enjoys reading, hiking, birding, traveling, probably not surprisingly, gardening, and exploring the beautiful Ozark Mountains with her husband, 2 children, and dog. I expect we'll have some time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can at that time. And with all that said, I will turn it over to Sara.
Thank you, Jordan. Hi, I'm Sara, and as Jordan said, I do live in the United States in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. I've worked for Pollinator Partnership for about 4.5 years now, and I'm so excited to be here presenting to you today. So Pollinator Partnership, or P2 or P2C in Canada, is the largest conservation organization in the world dedicated exclusively to the health of pollinators. And Pollinator Partnership and P2C administer a diverse variety of programming, such as Project Wingspan, which recently expanded into Canada, and of course, Bee City Canada. So here's a visual glance at a few of the many projects and resources that we offer. We administer Pollinator Week every year on the 3rd week of June, which is a great diving off point to celebrate pollinators. And here is the URL to the P2C webpage if you want to check out what all we are doing. So why do we care about pollinators? Well, many reasons. We need them to help us make food. They also provide food for other species. They provide many ecosystem services. They are an integral part of our planet's biodiversity. and simply they make the world more beautiful and interesting. Pollination is essential, with about 90% of flowering plants relying on them to reproduce. About 1/3 of our food is a result of pollinators. Foods we enjoy, such as fruits, vegetables, seeds, nuts, oils, and chocolate. Pollinators enhance ecosystem biodiversity. My background is in ornithology, as Jordan mentioned, and I'm a birder, so for me, pollinators are also an important food source for many birds. There was a study that was done that found that it takes between about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of chickadees. So that's a lot of caterpillars and pollinators. Pollinators also help regulate climate by sustaining vegetation. So who are the pollinators? They can be any animal that moves pollen, and this includes really a great diversity of animals. So the most obvious that we typically think of are insects. The most important, arguably, are bees, but also mammals can be pollinators. Birds, like of course hummingbirds, even some lizards and some cockroaches. And they've even found that there are some crustaceans that help pollinate seagrass underwater. So incredibly diverse group. Yet so many of our pollinators are in decline, as the headlines proclaim. And I like to point out this graphic on the right, which we refer to as the windshield phenomenon. 1998 is actually the year that I graduated high school. And I can remember driving around and my windshield looking like this picture in the top, which was a nuisance, but the alternative is the happy man in the picture on the bottom who has a clean windshield. But of course that's a problem because that just means that those insects are no longer in the environment anymore. So why are our pollinators in trouble? Well, there are 5 big culprits. Invasive species, pesticide misuse, parasites and disease, climate change, and habitat loss. And the interactions between these pressures only serves to amplify the obstacles facing pollinators. So enter the program that I manage, Bee Friendly Gardening, or BFG. It's a solutions-based program to help people install habitat, which our pollinators so desperately need. It is a membership program engaging the public to help protect, preserve, and promote pollinator health. And BFG is not only for backyard gardeners, it's for every landscape, as this graphic in the middle portrays. It's for neighborhoods, community food gardens, cities and park departments, landscapers, public gardens and parks, schools and college campuses, places of worship, rights of way, and businesses. So think about the places over which you have influence, where you can make a difference, and utilize those spaces to create pollinator habitat. Once you do, consider registering that habitat as a bee-friendly garden. So our goal this year in 2024 is to have 1,000 members and 500 registered bee-friendly gardens by the end of the year. We are actually beyond what even this graphic shows, at over 800 members now and almost 500 gardens. Once someone signs up, which you can do by scanning this QR code, and pays the annual membership fee, there's a whole host of benefits available, starting with the digital welcome packet that you will receive upon sign up, which will unlock all of your other member benefits, such as a monthly newsletter, a personalized certificate with a unique member number, and opportunities to interact with and be inspired by other BFG members, which I personally think is the best benefit. This is the public-facing website to give you a feel for what you will see if you navigate to our page. There's also a password-protected members-only webpage that you will have access to upon joining. You will be displayed on our maps and have the option to join our members-only Facebook page, as well as having access to resources to help you create a pollinator garden. And if you create habitat and register your bee-friendly garden, you will be encouraged to join the BFG iNaturalist project to document the pollinators that your garden is attracting, and eligible to purchase the official BFG sign. So Bee Friendly Gardening is partnering with Bee City Canada to leverage resources and engage members of both programs in order to maximize our impacts. Bee cities commit to 3 actions. By integrating bee-friendly gardening into their programming, bee cities can enhance their commitment to supporting pollinator habitats, fostering community engagement, and achieving sustainability goals. This approach not only strengthens environmental stewardship, but also creates educational opportunities that inspire communities to protect pollinators and promote biodiversity. The inclusion of bee-friendly gardening in bee city programming helps incentivize habitat creation in residential landscapes. Bee-friendly gardening enhances public awareness by educating citizens on the critical role of pollinators in sustaining biodiversity, food security, and healthy ecosystems, encouraging proactive community involvement in conservation efforts. Using bee-friendly gardening within Bee City Canada programming can be a highly effective way to promote Pollinator Week, engaging communities and highlighting the importance of pollinator conservation. We are developing an outreach kit to outline the benefits of incorporating bee-friendly gardening into your Bee City programming. This is an opportunity for municipalities to promote BFG and receive benefits based on varying tiers of support. Soon, Jordan will be reaching out to you with more information. At the heart of bee-friendly gardening is bee-friendly habitat. So we will spend the remainder of our time together today discussing habitat creation. There are 3 main components of good pollinator habitat: food or floral resources, nesting habitat, and protection from pesticides. When creating habitat, these are components you should consider when incorporating food resources for pollinators. Native plants are the gold standard, so whether trees, shrubs, forbs, or grasses, and the more that you can include, the better. You want to consider when designing your garden that you include species of plants that are blooming from early spring all the way through late fall. So ideally, you would have 3 species blooming in each season. You want to include a diversity of floral shapes, colors, sizes, and heights. Consider adding host plants into your space. Perhaps the most well-known host plant relationship is that of the milkweed and the monarch butterfly. So if you want to help monarchs, one of the best things that you can do is to plant milkweed. Consider offering moist soil and water or sand, and plant whatever species you decide to incorporate. Instead of spreading them all out, plant them in clumps or clusters. The second component of habitat is nesting or overwintering habitat. We have over 4,000 native bee species in North America. 70% nest under the ground, and 30% are cavity or stem nesters. So offering a variety of nesting habitat ensures that you are catering to a variety of native bees in the area. Elements to consider incorporating include bare patches of soil so that those ground nesting bees can access the ground. Mud and leaves, as bees use these to create separation between their nesting cells. You can see the photo on the left has these perfect little circles that were cut out by leafcutter bees. Consider leaving woody debris rather than clearing it. Oftentimes you'll get like beetles that'll burrow out of downed wood and create these exit holes that are perfect cavities for pollinators to go in and nest. Hollow or pithy stems of spent wildflowers or shrubs also make perfect habitat for stem nesting bees, if they can hollow those out and use those. Again, we have host plants, as those are where some things are seeking to lay their eggs. Leaf litter provides fantastic habitat for winter refugia so that they have a safe place to spend the winter. And then bunch grasses create these perfect interfaces with the ground where things like bumblebees can burrow down underground and use maybe old rodent burrows to make their nest sites. Component of healthy habitat is to provide a safe chemical-free space. So we want to promote the use of integrated pest management, or IPM, in your garden, which is a science-based process to solve pest problems while minimizing risk to people and the environment. So in order to implement IPM strategies in your garden, you really need to understand your system. You need to take time to observe the interactions that are taking place within your garden. Beneficial insects are really important because if you have them in your garden, then they will keep pests in check and keep, the balance in your garden so that you don't need to use those chemicals. The beneficial insects are doing it for you. I would also encourage you to redefine, quote, pests, what you think of as a pest. Are you willing to tolerate the presence of some insects or weeds in your garden? Are they really doing any harm? Many people strive for a lawn that looks like the photo on the top, which is a monoculture of turfgrass. However, things like dandelions and clover can add a splash of color while also feeding early emerging bees when little else is available for them to eat. So kind of just reframing and redefining what you think of as a pest and your tolerance levels is important. If you are going to use pesticides, which we recommend only as a very last resort, make sure that you read and follow all the label directions. Make sure that you time their application to minimize exposure to pollinators. Don't apply when plants are in bloom. And just use as little as possible. Choose targeted treatments over mixes and use spot treatments where possible. So you've done your research and you're ready going on this garden. So the first thing is preparing your site. And I can't stress enough how important site prep is. You don't want to skimp now because your efforts now will pay off in dividends later. You need to remove the sod, which forms a thick mat so that no seeds that you sow will reach the soil, as well as invasives and non-desirable plants before planting what you want. It's really important to have bare dirt to have good seed to soil contact in order to have successful germination. The use of compost versus mulch in your garden. Mulch is organic debris. It's not fully broken down, so things like wood chips and leaves and straw. Mulch helps retain moisture and suppress weed growth, and it is invaluable in getting your new garden established. Compost actually is added to your soil to improve the nutrient composition. Oftentimes, native plants don't need compost. It's good for building soil from nothing, and it's good for your vegetable gardens, but it can actually cause native plants to grow too tall and flop over. So there are many ways to eliminate existing vegetation and prepare the soil for a garden. The most common methods are some of these, like sheet mulching, lasagna gardening, solarization, sod removal, tilling, or a combination of those listed. So there's no one wrong way to prep a garden. You can choose the method that best suits your style of gardening. The size of your space and the amount of labor that will be involved often dictate your method. So some, like solarization and sod removal, are more ideal for small areas, while a steady supply of free cardboard and wood chips can make sheet mulching a good candidate for larger areas. And some of these methods may be used in tandem. You can just kind of experiment and find the method that works for you. Perhaps you opt to sheet mulch an area and then create a raised bed on top via the lasagna method, for example. Or solarize a location and sheet mulch over it for extra weed prevention. So I would encourage you, if you're building a garden, to do a little bit of research into these methods. For example, solarization is only going to work well in an area that receives a whole lot of direct sunlight. So if you have a shadier area, then it might not be the right one for you to use. So just be mindful of the method that you're going to use. Make sure it's appropriate for your space. And most importantly, just make sure that you implement a site prep method to get your spot prepared to plant so that you will be successful. If you plan to utilize raised beds or containers, then have those built, prepped, filled with soil, and ready. And make sure that you have access to water nearby, especially if you're doing a community planting project or maybe like a park in town. You want to make sure that you've located a water source that you're able to use, because it is going to be important in the establishment of your garden. Try not to compact the soil in your workspace. Minimize walking in the area. Consider the use of stepping stones and walking paths. Not only are these useful for planting day, but they're an active component of your garden. When you create borders and you add edging, it makes your space look intentional, which is important when you're creating a more naturalized pollinator garden. Sometimes those cues for care to let the public and passersby know that this space is intentional and not just a result of neglect. I would suggest that you sketch out a rough plan of how you envision your garden looking ahead of time. This photo on the left shows one of our BFG members' plans that they submitted in. It is important to manage your expectations at this point, as often this plan will change with time. I would suggest that you start out small. So start out with a few plants in a small area and add more over time as you build your garden. If you start small, it gives you the chance to maintain it and get it established before it becomes too big and overwhelming, at which point some people just give up. And then we don't want that. We want you to be successful. And finally, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but consider planting in clumps so that pollinators can find and visit many flowers in one location. It basically, you're creating a target for whatever plant that pollinator is seeking. They're going to be more likely to find it. And also it provides a worthwhile food stop for them. Plant tall plants behind and shorter plants up front. If you're gonna incorporate shrubs, then add those in the back of the garden. Small trees may be included in the garden. Just consider their shade footprint and how it may alter sun availability to plants below as that tree grows. Probably large trees are better planted somewhere else in your yard. Most pollinator plants are sun-loving plants. And so if you plant a small tree that later becomes a big tree, it's probably going to shade out a lot of those plants and they might not do so well. So consider microhabitats and the shade that may be created by buildings and existing vegetation, or even fences or things that are going to block out some of that sun that maybe you didn't account for in your planning. Use ground covers liberally. Plant them in between your plants. These can be things like violets or native strawberries, as they act as a great living mulch. And I typically like to space plants closer than is recommended when I plant them. I think it looks more natural and it reduces the need for mulch and it minimizes weeds. So I just allow those ground covers to fill in the spaces and you get a really naturalized look that doesn't require as much maintenance on your part. So make sure that you gather all of your supplies before you get started, as it will eliminate frustration down the road. Lay out a tarp with extra soil and or compost. I'm always perplexed. You would think that if you dig a hole and you remove that dirt and then you have a plant that already has a root ball and some dirt and put it in and replace the dirt, that you would actually have extra dirt. But somehow this defies all logic and I always end up with less dirt than I started with, it seems. So it's nice to have a supply of dirt nearby or soil that you can use to fill in that excess space when you're planting. And just make sure that you have all the proper tools that you're going to need to do the job that are going to make your job easier. You know, shovels, spades, garden gloves, things like that. So hopefully when you get to the point that you're ready to plant, you've done your research and you've selected native plants appropriate for your region. And here I would direct you to our website. We have many wonderful resources to help you make your plant selections. We have zip code based eco-regional guides that you type in your zip code and it's going to give you an appropriate list of native plants for your region. We have the Find Your Roots tool, which allows you to enter some more parameters depending on what it is that you're looking for that site, site conditions and things like that. And our newest Guide to Guides, which compiles multiple resources across region and land use type. So there's really something on there for everybody depending on what you're looking for. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. So now comes the fun part. It's time to purchase those plants and get to your site. So when you're planting, keep in mind timing. The best time to plant native seeds is in winter. Many of them require a cold, moist stratification period to germinate. So you want to get them out there in the winter. They can go through some of those freeze-thaw cycles, and then they will germinate in spring. And then if you're creating a garden largely of plugs or plants, avoid summer. Summer is just really hard on everything. So try to do that in spring or fall. Of course, you can always try to grow your own plants from seed it can be a cost-effective method to get plants without actually buying the plants because seeds are less expensive. If you don't have a greenhouse, no problem. You can create your own mini greenhouses and winter sow seed via the milk jug method, which if you simply Google, you'll find a how-to on how to create those little mini greenhouses and sow your own seed. So next you're going to want to take those plants that you hauled home from the nursery and set them out where you want to plant them. And I like to do this first because it gives you a really good visual of what it's going to look like, and it allows you to respace or rearrange as needed once you can visualize that garden. And keep in mind the earlier recommendations on height and spacing and those micro habitats with the shading. So it's a good time to go ahead and dig holes the size of the pot. You can actually sit your pot down inside to make sure it's an adequate size. If your plants are root bound in their pots, then it really is good to kind of gently shake or separate out those roots or tease them apart before you stick them down in the ground. It'll help them to do better. Sit the plant down gently in the soil, in the hole, and then backfill with the soil that you had removed and the extra soil. And really just you want to make sure that there aren't any air pockets underneath your plant, like a space. So add soil as you need and just kind of tap down around the edges to get that good and filled in. And then immediately after planting, give those plants a good soak. You're going to want to keep them well watered during establishment, which is really the first year. And it's better to water them less often and more deeply, maybe even just once a week or twice a week if it's especially hot or dry, rather than multiple shallow waterings, because that will help them to create those deep roots. It's going to help them to survive in those dry periods. And then this is when you would use that mulch that we talked about to retain moisture and suppress weeds. And mulch can also increase soil health by returning nutrients. So good mulch includes compost, leaves, living ground covers like we talked about. But just remember, you probably don't want to use a really thick layer of wood chips everywhere, as bees cannot access the ground to nest. And remember, 70% of our native bees are ground nesting, so you're knocking them out of having nest sites. So I really like this slide. It kind of shows us what's going on underground that we don't necessarily get a chance to see, but many native plants after the first year may only need supplemental watering during drought or if they're showing signs of heat stress. And you can see why. Because prairie plants are characterized by their deep and extensive root systems, and that makes them more tolerant to drought compared to, say, in that graphic on the left, some of our turfgrass species. You can see in the very, very left, the turfgrass has pretty much non-existent roots compared to some of those that go up to 16 feet. So the two photos on the right, these were an exhibit at the U.S. Botanic Garden, and I think that it wonderfully shows you what you don't see underground, but they covered these roots in glycerin to preserve them, and you can see what is underground, and it captures the disparity between the above ground and below ground biomass that we don't often realize is down there. So in addition to needing minimal water, Plants that are adapted to your ecoregion don't need special care. They're resistant to most insects and diseases, and they attract beneficial insects. Okay, so weeding is necessary to maintain the presence of the desired plants and eliminate those that you don't want. So this is just all part of the maintenance involved in building a new garden. Your garden will be constantly evolving. So some plants are short-lived biennials, like this cardinal flower or lobelia that bloomed in my garden once, and then it was long gone. So that gave me a chance to come in and replace that hole with something different and new. And some plants will self-seed and may move within your garden over time. So it's a constantly changing canvas. And then we have things to consider like seasonal maintenance. So as we're getting now into the fall season, don't necessarily think of fall as a time to clean up, but rather a time to prepare for rest and recharging. Plants are dormant, pollinators are hibernating. And remember catchy phrases such as these. They put nutrients back into the soil and provide habitat for overwintering insects. It's okay to have an uneven garden. Structure and texture can provide interest and be beautiful. Not to mention, it is critical for pollinators to have a place to overwinter and breed. If we're only providing beautiful plants for them to feed off of, but not supporting them through the rest of their cycle, we're only helping with part of the problem. You can cut spent flowers back so that the stems are varying heights between 8 to 24 inches. That will help those stem nesting bees. Dead and decaying wood is valuable, so fallen logs, rotting snags and limb piles, and many caterpillars find refuge in leaves on the ground during the winter. When we refer to save the stems, this graphic on the right from Heather Holm is a good visual depiction of how that actually works across seasons. So in spring, the flower stems are cut between 18 to 24 inches, which opens those up for those stem nesting bees. This can also be an example of chop and drop, as simply dropping the cut flower heads allows them to decompose and contribute nutrients back towards your soil. And the figure on the left shows some plants that have suitable hollow or pithy stems that create great stem nesting bee habitat. So don't forget to take photos and document the beautiful pollinators that show up to enjoy your hard work. This is the why. This is why we're building the garden. So make sure that you remember and enjoy that part of it. Signs explaining what you are doing are so important to raise awareness and encourage neighbors to get involved. The 3 signs on the left are from some of our Be Friendly Gardening members' gardens. We also have 2 free printable garden signs on the pollinator.org website. So here's just kind of my own photo journey that I wanted to share with you. Much experience and what I've learned has come from experimenting in my own yard. I don't actually live at this house anymore. We moved a year ago and I sadly left it all behind. I brought some of it with me though, but we bought this house in 2015 and it was just, you know, kind of a builder grade house in a neighborhood where they all look the same, very small lots, pretty sterile lots. And we just worked every year to add a little bit more pollinator habitat over time. So like we mentioned earlier, it's a good idea to start with a plan, but be willing to adapt and be flexible as your plan nearly always evolves as you plant. So you can kind of see the before pictures. And then these photos show some of my early plantings. Early on, I used a lot of mulch when I had few plants and small plants. And then about 3 to 4 years in, this is what that same space looked like. So I definitely made mistakes and I learned a lot through the process. And now that I've moved and have a chance to start over, I'm implementing some of those things that I learned. But one example is my mom loves to bring me plants when she comes to visit. She doesn't live nearby. And she gave me something that had a little sprout, something in the bottom that I didn't really question. And come to find out, it was this plant called Creeping Jenny. And it quickly took over my entire side yard, and I spent the next 8 years trying to rip it out. So that was a mistake. But you can see in the photo on the right, there's some milkweed and bearded beggar ticks or tick seed sunflower, Biden's Aristosa. I collected some seeds from a local prairie. And so I slowly converted that to a native planting, but I still was fighting that ground cover. And also I mentioned it's not advised to fertilize many native plants as it will cause them to grow too tall. So I didn't amend my soil at all, and still I struggle with them growing really tall and leggy and falling over. So these are pictures of phlox and gray-headed coneflower. And in retrospect, I would have moved them much farther back because they would flop over the path and they would be covered in bees, and then my children wouldn't want to walk down the path. So again, just more lessons that you learn as you go. It also became a really fun game for us over time to add various host plants and watch for their caterpillars. And it truly was an example of if you plant it, they will come, because pretty much every time we added a host plant, that same year we would get the caterpillar on it, which was really fun. So things like Dutchman's pipevine for pipevine swallowtail, passion flower for Gulf fritillary, and of course the milkweeds for monarchs. And I will just remind you that when you plant those host plants, we're planting them to be eaten. So they might look pretty ratty by the end of the season, but that just means they're doing their job. So all of these practices that we discussed today are scalable, from the smallest container garden to a backyard garden to demonstration and community gardens. This is the USDA People's Garden in Washington, D.C., to large-scale restoration sites like this prairie in Arkansas. Adding habitat will have a positive influence no matter how much size you have influence over. And anyone can create habitat, no matter how small your space. Even a window box or a couple of potted plants provides valuable food resources. So if you think about a migrating butterfly who has to hopscotch across the landscape, then your containerized pollinator plant might be just what it needed to sustain it to the next patch of food resources it can find. So these photos are from our conservation program manager who lives in Ohio on a second floor balcony. And she has created this mini habitat patch that includes 17 species of native wildflowers blooming from spring to fall. And she gets all kinds of pollinators there, including hummingbirds. And that's all on a balcony. So your space has a lot to offer, and it can make a big impact. You can increase your impact by recruiting your neighbor. It is hard for pollinators to find floral and host plant resources if they are few and far between. And I like to point out here that some of our native solitary bees have such tiny home ranges that they may complete their entire life cycle in only your backyard. So your yard basically could be their whole world. So consider the home you're creating for them. Are you providing food? Are you providing a place for them to raise their young? Are you providing a safe pesticide-free environment for them? Wildlife and habitat corridors create connectivity on the landscape for these pollinators. And neighborhoods and cities can play an important role in this. It's important to extend your efforts into your own yard and beyond if possible. And bee cities are perfectly positioned to influence residents to do something, anything really, for pollinators, thus increasing connectivity on the landscape. So many possibilities of land use types on which we can install habitat, creating so many potential corridors and networks. There's a lot of marginal land in our daily environment. So imagine if all of these unutilized spaces were turned into pollinator habitat. In some of these pictures, we see parking lot medians, landscaping outside of businesses, those boulevard strips in between the streets and the sidewalks. Oftentimes it just takes somebody to spearhead the conversion of this into habitat. We know that creating habitat is good for pollinators, but it's also good for communities. So pollinators, celebrating pollinators, creating habitat, and engaging with people we may not have otherwise without a common goal of pollinator conservation are all wonderful ways to connect with others in nature at a community level, leading to global benefits. So thank you for your time today and learning about bee-friendly gardening and habitat creation. And there's my email address. Any of you are more than welcome to reach out. And I'm also happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the great presentation. Super nice to see pictures of your own garden too. It's great to hear about all the success you had with the host plants. Um, it looks like we've got a good 15 minutes or so for questions. So I see we've got a couple that have come in, and anyone that would like to ask a question, you can put that in the Q&A. Looks like the ones we've got are related to what do you do in your garden in the fall. So there's one in the chat. I think, unfortunately, the person that asked it had to head out, but it's probably of general interest. So they asked if you want to rake up leaves on your property during the course of the year, what month should you do that? And probably generally, how should you go about that?
Yeah, good question. First and foremost, I advise that you leave them there, but I also realize that sometimes, especially if you have a treed property, sometimes it gets a little unwieldy and you feel like you have to remove some of them. Um, you know, I'm not bagging them up and sending them out with the trash, right? Because you literally are throwing away pollinators when you're doing that. So if you can find like an out of the way area of your garden to rake them into and pile them, then it doesn't really matter when you do it, right? Because most of those pollinators that are in that leaf litter, if you move them out to the perimeter property, they're still going to complete their life cycle. They're going to be there come spring. They're going to be fine. So that's a good alternative if you have a place to do that. I know that here where I live, like sometimes people who, like I was talking about that yard that I bought, we didn't have any trees. I mean, it was just bare contractor dirt. And sometimes people that live in places like that understand the value of the leaves for compost and mulching will actually post on like Facebook and they'll come pick it up for you. So you might be surprised at the ability to find somebody who's willing to come and haul your leaves off for you. And they're taking those pollinators with them. They're taking them off site, and presumably locally in your neighborhood, so we don't have to worry about the transfer of things out of their area. But that could be a solution as well. And sometimes I've found, that they really do, like if you kind of put them over into an area, if you have a bigger space that you can tolerate them being, they break down pretty quickly, really. So, and composting, another thing, if you don't have a compost bin, then you could start one and you can just compost those leaves.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So many alternatives to bagging them up. So yeah, that's fantastic.
Right.
Yeah. And then we had one other one kind of in the same vein, but I don't think I know the answer. It's kind of a tricky one. Someone asked, do pollinators overwinter lower in the stems of flowers? Or I guess in the stems, like where do they tend to be as they're overwintering? And knowing that, would there be an ideal place to kind of cut them off? It's a tough one.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think it's species dependent. That's why, like, if you put out some of those artificial nest boxes, it's often recommended to drill like holes of varying sizes because different species are going to have different preferences. But as far as depth goes, I don't know the answer to that, other than what I can say is one way to kind of bypass the worry about if you're, where you're cutting is when you cut those stems off, what you can do is you can just kind of bundle them together. You've probably seen the bee houses where they literally are just like bundles of reeds or bamboo. So basically you're recreating that and cut those stems and you can bundle them together. And again, kind of put them out on the periphery of your space. And then any pollinators that have nested inside of those will be fine. They'll still continue their life cycle and they'll emerge when it's time. And then you've done no harm by trimming those down.
Yeah,
Kind of
that's
like
a
the
great
leaves.
call.
You just don't want to like bag them and send them off site, right? Or burn them or something. You're still allowing them to proceed just in a different spot of your yard.
Totally. Yeah, it's a good tie into the bee houses too. That's some of my favorite bee houses are the ones where you put in the little kind of straws and then you can just replace them year after year. Then you don't have to deal with cleaning. Yeah, that's a great answer.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that too. And there is, if you go to our website, we have these, they're called quick reference guides, and there's one on bee houses. So if anybody's interested in installing a bee house, we do caution against bee houses can be beneficial, but they can also be detrimental. So it's not something that you really just kind of put out once and forget about it. And then 5 years later, you're still looking at your bee house. To do it right, they really do require some maintenance. Just be aware that if you're going to install a bee house, do a little bit of research and make sure that you're doing it correctly.
Yeah, very good point to make. And if you're going to do one thing, habitat over bee houses, but bee houses can be great. Um,
Yes.
looks like we got a bunch of questions coming in. So, what is the lasagna method of site prep?
Yeah, so kind of like the name implies, you're building your garden in layers, or your substrate, you're building it in layers like a lasagna. And just like my lasagna recipe might be different than your lasagna recipe, there's no one way to do it, but it's that same foundational idea of building it in layers. So kind of like with composting, if you know like your browns and your greens, or like your carbon and your nitrogen inputs, you're creating those layers of browns and greens. It's almost like you're building a compost bin, but right on site. So, maybe you put like a thick of somebody was saying, here's a good use of your leaves, just build a pollinator garden, right? So, locate your spot. Maybe you put down some cardboard layers, and then maybe you put down, some green grass clippings, and then maybe you come back in the fall and you add a layer of those leaves that have fallen, and then you come back on top of that and you put like what you would put by greens. It can be anything that's like living, right? So it can be like your kitchen waste, or like I said, your grass clippings. So what you're doing is you're just building these layers like a lasagna on top of each other, and then as that slowly decomposes and breaks down, you'll have really great garden soil that you can just build, you can plant right into. It's a ready-made garden.
Awesome. And the next question is this is a really good one, probably one that a lot of people have difficulty with. So when you buy plants from a nursery, how can you tell that the plant is actually one that benefits pollinators? Because this person has heard that some plants, while they have very pretty flowers, don't actually produce food for pollinators.
That is a wonderful question. And you're kind of hitting on the whole idea of like cultivars, right? So, unfortunately, in many of our big box chain stores, it can be difficult to find native plants that they're selling. So I would refer you first back to some of those resources that I mentioned, like our eco-regional planting guides, and I would arm yourself with knowledge of what's native in your area before you go to these stores. Because then otherwise it's just overwhelming. So whether you actually go with a printout, or you just start to familiarize yourself with what's native in your area, that way when you go to these garden stores, you kind of know what you're looking for, because you do have to look hard. And I have a lot of, local native plant nurseries here where I live, and I know they're becoming more common as this movement grows and people realize the value of native plant gardening. So hopefully you have a nursery within driving distance that does kind of specialize in native plants, and that takes a lot of the guesswork out. But if all you have access to, is a large chain store, it can be difficult. And, cultivars are, which is, I assume, what you're alluding to, maybe it was a native plant at one point, but we've adapted it in some way for showier flowers or bigger flowers. I mean, sometimes that's at the expense of nectar or pollen production. And so while it looks beautiful when a pollinator gets to that plant, there may be nothing in it for the pollinator, no reward or nothing that it's getting out of it. And so like one really obvious way to tell if something is a cultivar when you go to the nursery is it will have, it'll say like purple coneflower or echinacea, but then beside it in quotes, it'll say, and I'm totally making this one up, but like purple beauty or something. So it'll have some kind of descriptor beside it. And that's telling you that that is a cultivar that has been bred of that straight species plant. And there are people everywhere doing studies on this right now, and it really runs the gamut between some cultivars actually have more bang for their buck down to some are just completely sterile. And there's no good answer because it really is species dependent and you just have to kind of look into it. So good question though.
Yeah, very great comprehensive answer too. I know it can be pretty hard. I remember when I started getting interested in getting plants for pollinators, there's a garden center that I would go to, and like there's so many plants, and there was literally like this one section at the back that had some really good options. But now, like if I go to just a native plant nursery, it's so nice for you just show up and you're like a kid in a candy store. You're just like everything's good. You're just having fun. Yeah, it is complicated.
That's the easy way to do it if you're lucky enough to have access to one for sure.
Exactly, if you're lucky enough. Um, Another question we got, do we consider wasps to also be pollinators, or are they unwanted insects?
No, wasps are also pollinators, and wasps, we made reference earlier to beneficial insects. Wasps can actually be extremely beneficial in your garden. There are parasitic wasps that lay their eggs sometimes, and some of these pests, what we would consider in many gardens and things like pests. And so they may parasite them by laying eggs in them and they keep them in check. So I know sometimes it's easy to kind of villainize insects, especially groups of insects like wasps that can be rather aggressive at times, but no, wasps have their place too.
Totally. Another question is, where can we subscribe or become a member of BFG? It sounds like this person's looked at pollinatorpartnership.ca and couldn't find. I know we've got it
Yeah,
on Pollinator
sure.
Partnership.
Yeah, you can get to it from the pollinator.org website, or I can just tell you to make it really easy for you. If you just go to befriendlygardening.org, it'll take you right to the BFG webpage. So befriendlygardening.org. But you can find it from those pull down menus from the pollinator.org website. At the top, I think it says like programs is one of them. And then if you pull it down, you can get to Be Friendly Gardening. Oh, but from the Pollinator Partnership Canada website, I think it's under our where we work or our work or something in the pull down menu.
Yeah, I'm just looking
So
on it now.
definitely,
You got to go. Our work is right. And then it's the third one down, Be Friendly Gardening. So you should be able to find it there.
but maybe what I can do. Oh, it won't let me post to everybody. Maybe in the chat, one of you can just put the URL, befriendlygardening.org, and make it easy for people to click on. I don't know
Yeah,
why it
that
won't
sounds
let
good.
me.
I'm just doing that now. There we go. Just added the URL to the chat, so people should be
Thank
able to
you.
get it. Oh, and I see someone beat me to it anyway. Yep.
Yeah,
Thanks, Adrian.
that's what I was just
That's awesome.
accessing the chat for the first time, and I see there's a lot of good stuff in there. So yeah, thanks everyone.
I think there might be one more. Uh, if we select a planting site that already has established plants in it, is it better to leave plants even if they aren't native, or would it be better to remove them and replace them with native plants?
Yeah. So I certainly like we don't want to give you the impression that you should not have anything in your garden that's not native. Like that's not realistic, and we don't want to villainize non-native plants because a lot of people love their early blooming daffodils, for example, or their, grandma's peonies that were handed down. And it's totally fine to include stuff like that in your garden that is sentimental and they have meaning and you just really enjoy. So really, we try to steer away from invasive plants, right? So non-native invasives, of which most cities maintain like a noxious weed list, so I would just make sure that you're not purposely incorporating something like that that can actually be harmful or damaging to the environment in your garden. But as long as they clear that list and it's something that has value to you in your garden, then I'm not telling you that you need to go tear it out and replace it. I will say that there have been a lot of studies done more recently that tend to suggest that 70% is kind of a really good number to strive for when it comes to native plants. Kind of referring back to that chickadee study that I mentioned and how many caterpillars it takes to raise chickadees. There were some studies that were done as kind of an offshoot of that found that like in yards that had 70% native plants, they ended up having more caterpillars that in turn could support like the chickadees, for example. So just always strive towards more, I would say, adding more, adding a new one every year, add a new host plant like we did at my house every year. Um, but don't feel like you have to go in and rip out the other things that you enjoy.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Every little bit more is great, but yeah. So that is all the time
Exactly.
we've got. It is 1:59. So thanks so much, Sarah, for joining and introducing bee-friendly gardening and going through how to create habitat for pollinators. I learned a lot of stuff from this presentation. Super helpful. Um, Thank you to everybody who took time out of your day to join. Hopefully you also learned some useful information that you can apply to your gardening efforts. Maybe you even want to register your garden as a bee-friendly garden. And as Sarah mentioned, we're going to be sending out some additional information to Bee City members about ways that you can engage with the Bee Friendly Gardening program. So we'll be in touch about that soon. The webinar was recorded both in English and French. So we're going to have both of those versions up on the Bee City Canada YouTube in the near future, probably later this week. And we'll send out a follow-up email with the links to that. And with all that said, that concludes this webinar. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and stay tuned for upcoming Bee City webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much.